The topic that I'm going to address in this lecture is higher education in Africa, and I'm going to take a historical overview. And there are two important things that I need to point out as we start. The first one is that I come to the topic on higher education in Africa less so as an expert, but more so as a student. I'm constantly learning about Africa, and I'm constantly learning about higher education in Africa, and that's why I think about myself more as a student. The second thing I wanted to point out is that when I was growing up in Zimbabwe, I didn't think about Zimbabwe, the country, and Africa, the continent, as an object of study. And when I came to the US for graduate studies, I had to do a mental shift where here and in graduate school, Africa was more so an object of study. And I think I had to work my way in my mind about striking a balance between Africa as a place, as home, as an identity, but also as an object of study. So because of these two issues that I've pointed out, I have more questions probably than answers, and that's the approach that I bring to studying this topic. The two countries that I've highlighted for you here on the screen, the green is Zimbabwe, which is home for me. The orange one is South Africa, and that's the country context of my dissertation research, which I carried out at one of the top rated universities in South Africa. I have highlighted these two countries because you are probably going to hear a lot more about those two countries than about any of the other countries on the continent, but I will intentionally try to make sure that I reach out to the other regions and other countries on the continent as we talk about the history of higher education on the continent. The guiding questions for the discussion we are going to have is, there's a couple of them, but I wanted to make sure that I point this out to you. The first one is very key because it helps us to think about who public universities belong to, who they serve, and why. So, for instance, do public universities belong to the state? Do they belong to the students? And which students? Do they belong to staff or faculty? Do they belong to funders who are investing in the operations going on in the universities? And if you want to take a moment, I'll give you a moment to think about the public universities either here in the US or in other places that you guys know of, and try to think about who owns these universities, who do they belong to? And I'll give you a moment to think about it. And I want you to hold on to that answer at the back of your mind as we go through this lecture, which will focus on the history of, but also the main debates concerning the establishment and development of public universities on the African continent, but also focusing on the current state of these universities, and lastly, the imagined future of higher education on the continent. And to do that, we will be branching out to talk about what type of knowledge universities generate and what knowledge is valued. What claims can different stakeholders make on the university? Why or why not those claims can be viewed as inappropriate or appropriate or valid or invalid? And also how public universities should respond to deeply political and competing claims. Let's probably step back and ask ourselves why we should care about education. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because the notion of education usually refers to formal Western schooling. Yet, we should all be aware that Western schooling is only one of many types of education systems. So, for instance, there are traditional religious education systems. There are initiation ceremonies. There are all types of apprenticeships that would be be called education. But I think in common usage, the term itself, the notion of education, has usually been used to refer to Western schooling. And in most cases, I want you to think about what alternative education systems are there aside from Western schooling as we go through this lecture. The other point about why we should care about education is mostly portrayed as a good thing. And you would be hard pressed to find people who think that education is not a good thing. So we have come to a point where education is a good thing by default. But again, I want you to be thinking about other people who have argued that education serves as an instrument to promote, but also to preserve privilege, and to promote the exclusion or to facilitate the exclusion of the marginalized, the poor, and a lot of people who are disadvantaged from the process of development. So education reflects, that's the point I'm trying to make, education reflects but also reproduces society's goals, yes. But in the process of doing that, there's a lot of marginalization that happens because education becomes central in the creation of national and international elites. The last point there on the slide. The rest of the points on the slide speak to why there is a lot of support for education across the world. So education is supposedly linked to increased personal and state development, including measures of health, but also civic engagement. This is the reason why education receives a huge proportion of many countries' budget. And in a lot of cases, in developing countries, we see that Western countries are pushing for education by funding or providing funding mechanisms for education. I want to move on right now to give you a sense of how we are going to talk about the history of higher education on the African continent. I have used what I call the periodization approach, where I have broken down the historical period into these four periods. So the colonial era, which is the pre-1960 era, and the 1960 is not a definite point because we do have countries that got independence after 1960. But I think for purposes of this lecture, I'm going to refer to the colonial era as the period before 1960. Then the independence era from the 1960s to the 1970s, which is where a lot of African countries were getting independent. Then the neoliberal era, 1980s, and then after that, the last era that I'm going to focus on is the 21st century. Again, I want to be clear that this approach of breaking down history into these periods is not the only approach. It's also not necessarily the best approach to studying or to understanding the history of higher education on the African continent. But I find this approach very useful for showing the stark differences in the thinking around and the practice of higher education in Africa across time. And I'm going to focus on a few illustrative examples. In other words, I'm going for breadth rather than depth. We could go for depth in a different lecture, but for now, it's really a broad sweep of what was going on the continent in terms of the development of higher education. So I will switch right now to talk about the first period, which is the colonial era. I do have a lot of text on this slide and in a couple other slides. I don't want to burden you with reading everything, so I have highlighted the key points I want to dwell on, and I have indicated them in red here on the screen. Most universities in Africa are colonial creations. They were started as overseas extensions of European institutions, and they were established either immediately before or within a decade after political independence. So that point is really important, recognizing that the foundation of or the establishment of universities on the African continent is very intricately linked to the colonial project. The purpose of higher education on the continent, I have two here. We could probably list more, but I wanted to point out these two which are very critical to this lecture. So universities in African countries were established to serve Western manpower and market needs. This means they were intended to train lower level workforce or functionaries in the colonial administration. So this includes bank clerks, teachers, and you name it. The universities, therefore, could be talked about as cultural seminaries, because part of why they were formed was to make sure that whoever went through the system was being prepared or trained to serve in the colonial administration or to serve the needs of the colonizers. The purpose of universities also then informs the role of the state. So the state designed and adapted the regulatory framework. So if universities were established to serve colonial purposes, that means the state, the colonial state, was responsible for designing and for adapting the regulatory framework for those universities. Funding, as you might imagine, was very much state-controlled. This model whereby funding was controlled by the state was also prevalent in continental Europe, where the state was the main funder, if not the only funder for higher education, and this was adapted in the colonial, in the colonies as well. Access for higher education was very restricted, and I have a map here on the left that shows portions of the continent that were colonized by particular European states. So in places on the continent that were colonized by the Belgians, higher education was actually forbidden. For the places where the Spanish and Portuguese were in charge, enrollments were kept very low. The French, as you might have learned in elsewhere in this class, the French sent a few to France under the policy of assimilation. So access was different depending on where you were on the continent or in the colonies. I am going to skip the governance issue to talk about curriculum. They were very restricted and very limited fields, and mostly, probably exclusively, colonial languages were used as medium of instruction. I will give an example here of the situation in Zimbabwe, where I went to school and did my undergraduate studies. This is a copy of my high school certificate. And I want to draw your attention to, I want to illustrate here how the curriculum was determined by the colonizing country. So in our case in Zimbabwe, we were colonized by the British. And when I went to high school, and I cut out the year here, but I think it was 1993 when I got this certificate. The certificate I got was from the University of Cambridge, which by that time was working in collaboration with the University of Zimbabwe, or the Ministry of Education in Zimbabwe. 1993 was 13 years after independence. We gained independence in 1980 in Zimbabwe. So 13 years after independence, our high school exams were still run in conjunction with the University of Cambridge. This has obviously changed, and I just gave you the top part of my certificate because I didn't think you wanted to see my grades. But the point I'm illustrating really is how 13 years after independence, we were still tied to, in a lot of very interesting ways, but also fascinating ways, to the University of Cambridge. This has since changed. In 1995, Zimbabwe switched from working in collaboration with the University of Cambridge, and we established what we call ZIMSEC, or the Zimbabwe School Examination Council, which was part of the localization of exams. This process was going on for a couple of years, and I think all the other exams were localized in 2002, but the process started in 1995. The point here is, though, the colonial era, the system that was in place during the colonial era was set up in such a way that universities, but also the education systems, were beholden to, but also controlled from and regulated according to the colonial or colonizing power. This setup is responsible for what we see, or the state of higher education at independence. So when the colonial era is coming to a close in African countries, we see the legacies of colonialism in the education sector. And I have a couple of statistics here. I do want to point out that, as with any statistics, you want to take it with some grain of salt. But I'm using these statistics because they give us a very good idea of what the state of higher education was at independence. 3% of high school age students had secondary education. So only 3% had gained secondary education. In Zambia, there were only 100 university graduates when the country gained independence. And there were 1,000 secondary school students who had gone through the system. So if you go to the University of East Africa, which brought together Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, in 1961, there were 99 graduates, university graduates. And the population for these three countries was about 23 million. And I want you to get a sense of how much or how little education had actually been accomplished during the colonial era. The situation in Zaire, which is present-day DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, when the country gained independence, there was no engineer, there was no lawyer, there was no doctor in the country. And this is important because, as I'm going to show you in a little bit, the situation we see in a lot of the African countries need to be talked about in relation to this history. French-speaking Africa, or the whole French-speaking Africa, there were 4 graduates in agriculture, right? In the English-speaking Africa, there are about 150 between that period, 1952 to 1962. This is critical when we think about, I'm going to give you the case study here for the Congo, but also for Malawi. And in the case of the DRC went through 8 years of colonial rule. And following that colonial rule, the numbers that I have here on the screen for you tell a story about education not being a priority of the colonial masters in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Someone, a Belgian colonial official, was cited as saying, if we have no black doctors if we have no I'm stumbling over that word. Engineers, if we don't have these, it's because we can send white doctors. We can send white veterinarians and engineers from Belgium. This is the reason why only 20 Congolese students had graduated from college. Only 2,000 Congolese students had high school education. There was no one who had gone to university, right? So these numbers are important today when we try to wrap our minds around the DRC crisis. That crisis is best understood when the situation is contextualized historically. And this is the point I want to make very emphatically right now, that the course, the history of colonialism was not just brutal in nature. It was also intended to make sure that no Congolese students would compete or challenge Belgian colonial rule. There was that fear that the emergence of a Congolese elite would challenge the Belgian rule in the Congo. And if we switch to Malawi, the situation was different in its own way, but the bigger narrative, the story, is the same really. 73 years of colonial rule in Malawi. After those 73 years of colonial rule in Malawi, very few students qualified for entrance into higher education. Very few Malawian students. Higher education was not even available in the country. There was no university in Malawi when the country gained independence. So if you wanted to gain a college degree, you had to go study outside of Malawi at that point. We do now have universities in Malawi, and these universities came after independence. The point being, during colonial rule, the 73 years that Malawi was under colonial rule, there was no effort to establish a university, which is why only 300 of 2,000 civil service posts at independence in Malawi, only 300 were filled by Malawians because they had not managed to get the education that they needed to assume these positions. I want to point out that today, Malawi is ranked as the third poorest country in the world, at least in 2018. The only two countries that were behind Malawi is Burundi and South Sudan. Now, there's a reason why Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world, and we can argue about the reasons, but I think it's fair to say part of it is during the 73 years of colonial rule, there was no effort to develop a Malawian cadre of educated Malawians who could take up positions of responsibility and propel the country to development. And development is a very pegged and very complicated word, obviously, but I am using it with that in mind. Malawi and the DRC these are not unique examples. These an example of what it probably is applicable in a lot of countries on the continent. By the way, 28 out of 28 poorest countries in the world, 23 are African countries, and African countries have this long history of colonization. Having talked about the colonial era, I want to switch now and talk about the independence era. We have briefly talked about what colonialism did and what it did not do to prepare local people in these countries for moving ahead in terms of education. So when independence happened, and I'm focusing now on the independence era from 1960 to the 1970s, what do we see happening in the sphere of higher education? I mentioned this earlier on. The 1960 to 1970 demarcation is important because I'm using it to recognize that following the independence of Ghana in 1957 a significant number of African countries gained independence in 1960, but also soon afterwards. Other countries obviously gained independence later on. Zimbabwe, as an example, independence came in 1980. But the sheer proportion of African countries that gained independence during this period, during the 1960 to 1970, accounts for why the 1960s were heralded as the year of Africa, but also as the development decade on the continent. There was early optimism that gaining independence would translate into very tangible development or progress. We are going to see whether that actually became a reality in African countries. But let's look at what the purpose of higher education was during the independence era. National universities became an obligatory symbol of independence, just as was the case with national flags or the national anthem, and in some cases the national dress. We see countries moving towards establishing or developing national universities. This is the reason why you have a lot of universities called the University of Zimbabwe, the University of Botswana, right? The University of Swaziland. This is because it was a very important symbol of national independence. As a result of that, these national universities played a critical national development role. In other words, national development became the core mission of these universities coming out of the colonial era. Unlike in the previous era, we see here the state taking quite a different role, where in similar ways there was a state ideology that was at the center stage during the colonial era. But in this case, we see nationalism turning into a state project. And the state and its ideology determined higher education policy. In this case, critical thought, which was critical to the state, was taken as subversive to the national project. Access to higher education during this time was also limited, just as was the case, but in a different way, or not really the same, but it was access was still limited to a small enclave of a small elite. Average higher education enrollment during this time was 4%, which is pretty low by any standards. If you compare this with the US, for instance, there were 659 higher education institutions in 2013 on the African continent. This compares with it's a stark comparison, right? Difference with more than 4,700 degree granting institutions in the US alone. So I'm using these numbers to show how small the proportion was of people who could go or gain access into higher education. The head of state, in terms of governance, the head of state heralded the ultimate authority in the national universities, right? Because it was a national project, it was tied into the development role of these universities. Most governments were very intolerant to criticism and to people who were not conforming to what was talked about as a national project. And I'm not going to talk about curriculum, but it's something that I can come back to if needed. I'm going to give an example here of how this turned out when the state controlled higher education policy and regulation. In the case of Zimbabwe, as in many other countries on the continent, the president, for instance, was the state president was the chancellor of the public universities. In my case, when I graduated with my bachelor's degree in 1999, the president of the country officiated at my graduation ceremony. And he was conferring the degrees. This became the only time really when I met the president in person and was able to shake his hand when he was officiating at the graduation ceremony. What are the implications when a state president is the chancellor of the universities? This is a recent story that you can go and actually read for yourself. I'm not going to give further details, but the woman in the red gown was the president's wife. And a few years ago, she graduated with a PhD at the University of Zimbabwe. The story says she did not earn this or studied for this degree. Actually, part of the story says she tried to study for a bachelor's degree and she was not successful. But then she graduated recently with a PhD. And here is the picture of the graduation ceremony when she was hooded by her own husband, the president of the state, earning a PhD. The story says there wasn't even the thesis or the dissertation wasn't found. And I guess if it shows up somewhere, probably someone was asked to write it. I don't know whether this is something that actually happened or you can read about it by yourself. But I'm trying to use this story to say this is what happens when universities become a state project. But the state project and the ideology is also then taken over by an individual who is running the country as his own personal business. And someone could just give the university a call and say, I want to come graduate with a PhD, make sure you set everything up for me. And when some of us are sweating it out for many, many years to try to get a PhD here at UW-Madison, my hair is turning gray trying to get the PhD. Someone could just probably give a call and say, I'm coming to get a PhD there. It obviously doesn't give a very good name to the university, but I'm using this to demonstrate the extreme of what can happen when the universities are taken over by the state, but also by individuals who are running the state. The third era in the development and the establishment of higher education on the continent is what I'm calling the neoliberal era, which stretches from the 1980s. This period and what is happening in universities is coming as a response to the failure, probably, of a state-led development project in African countries. And we see a new actor stepping in right now onto the higher education landscape, and this is the World Bank, which became the single largest source of development capital in the field of international education. As the leading multilateral agents in promoting the then emergent neoliberal agenda, the World Bank became a key player, but also a key actor in and it actually stepped to the forefront of shaping higher education policies on the African continent. During this time, the purpose of higher education changed, right, from being a national development project. Right now, higher education in this time period, higher education has become or is being pushed as a private good rather than a public good. So during the independence era, we see governments and countries thinking about education as good for national development. But right now, there's a more focus on skills that the market needs rather than as a development project for the countries. There might be linkages, obviously, between market needs and development needs, but I think the focus is entirely on the skills that the market would need. Funding for higher education, there is a drastic cut of higher education funding, and what we see now is the introduction of cost-sharing approaches to funding higher education, which I'm going to talk about more in a little bit. We could also talk about the curriculum and access and so on. But I think for now, I want to limit our discussion to what we see happening in terms of the funding and the purpose of higher education. Let's talk about in more detail about the World Bank, because this becomes a key player and is controlling what we see happening in higher education policy. So the World Bank, at a meeting in 1986, meeting of higher education ministers that were meeting in Harare, Zimbabwe, was pushing this agenda whereby the bank actually is making an argument that poor countries in Africa can't afford to invest in higher education. It's not a good investment for a couple of reasons. The major one being the fact that higher education is more on the private good side. It benefits the individual who is gaining a degree more than it benefits the public. And because of that reasoning that was coming out of the World Bank during this time, the African countries represented here were being encouraged to close off their universities. And if they were interested in training people for higher education or in terms of higher education, they were advised to send their graduates overseas or to send their students overseas to go gain education there. And this is tied to producing skills and producing or making education aligned more to the market demands. The agenda for higher education is modified, right, to trim, but also to restructure universities and higher education broadly in line with the demands of the market. In 1990, as you all know, the Education for All era comes in, and when the bank and other funders were pushing to plow resources in making sure that there's universal primary education, higher education gets defunded. Even now, when the World Bank has come around to say, oh, wait a minute, we need to focus on funding higher education, the re-engagement phase has come in with a lot of conditions, and those conditions are part of the cost-sharing mechanism that says, if you are the individual going to go to university is expensive, we might help you a bit, but we want you to shoulder the burden of also paying your way through universities. Part of what was going on during this war time, the late 1980s in Nigeria, for instance, there was a shift of emphasis from the arts and the humanities to the science fields, the engineering, so the STEM fields. And this shift is coming around because of the focus on the market. So the demands of the market is requiring people who are coming in trained in the STEM fields. And this is also the reason, this is mainly the reason why universities had to restructure their offerings and their funding mechanisms to make sure that we are funding the areas that are needed for producing the market needs or the skills needed for the market. The reason why the arts and the humanities were defunded was they don't speak to the market or they don't produce skills needed in the market. But I want you to be aware that in a lot of places in Africa, arts and the humanities need to be strengthened for the restoration of the African heritage, which was also eroded during colonialism. And these same areas that are critical to African heritage and keeping it alive are being funded or are being defunded and it becomes very critical for making sure that there are other funding streams that would support these projects. What were some of the impacts of the World Bank's policies on higher education in the continent? I won't go through all the bullet points, but the key thing here is what we see happening. I'll give a couple of examples, but what we see happening is the World Bank is providing much of the money, but beyond that, it's actually constraining other bilateral development partners from investing in higher education, rather investing in primary and secondary education. So playing primary and secondary education against higher education wasn't really benefiting either, because even if we push a lot of people through primary and secondary education, then we don't have the structures in place to make sure that those students, when they come out of the pipeline, they are ready to go to universities that are well funded and well resourced. So let me give you a few examples here of some of the impacts of the World Bank approaches to higher education. In Kenya, for instance, in May 1996, out of 6,000 students who were supposed to come to the Moi and the Egerton universities, 2,000 were deregistered over non-payment of fees and tuition. Because once we do the cost sharing and we implement or add in user fees, we eliminate book and food allowances, a lot of students coming from low-income backgrounds are not able to pay their way through university. And when that happens, that's why we see as much as 3,000 out of 6,000 students deregistering because they couldn't pay their way through university. And I could give you more examples, but I think this demonstrates what was going on and what the impact is when we introduced cost sharing to these universities. It excludes a lot of the students who cannot pay their way through university. The other aspect of the World Bank policies and its impacts on universities is the fact that the World Bank championed what is called the rate of return policies, which again, it's part of the cost sharing. The beneficiaries of education should share the exorbitant cost of producing a university graduate, right? So the bank's allusion to cost efficiency and equity appealed in the language of both the market but also democracy, which clearly played off primary against higher education, like I said a moment ago. And this is actually very evident from what was happening at Makerere University in Uganda, which was established in 1922 and became a residential university in the post-World War II era. And during this time, it was a very elite colonial institution, as you might imagine from what we talked about earlier on. There were full merit-based scholarships, but it was just a few people who were going into the university. 1962, when Uganda gains independence, there are reforms that are targeted towards Africanizing staff in teaching programs, but we also see the state apparatus coming in to train human resources, and then there's a lot of these ideological classes that I referred to earlier on. In the 1980s, in the neoliberal era that I'm focusing on right now, the logic that was happening, the logic that was pushing what was happening in higher education is higher education has net cost that yielded, so the net cost yielded few beneficiaries. And I think this is the logic that's guiding what the World Bank is pushing for in terms of cutting back the role of the state in higher education. If a few beneficiaries are coming out of higher education, then why should the state bother in investing in what is the benefit for a few people? So public funds are shifted from higher education to primary education, which is cheaper and can be spread over to benefit a lot more people. Now, the cost of these reforms in higher education is that there's once you say let's cut back the role of the state and let's have students pay for themselves and families take care of their expenses, we see a whole lot of things going on. Number one being there's an expansion of student numbers because we expand by opening up because there are no scholarships. While we are marginalizing a big group of students, those who can afford to pay can actually come in their numbers into the universities. And once those numbers increase, the teaching load, obviously, faculty members who probably cannot be expanded because of funding limitations, we see those faculty members having to deal with loads of students in classes. And a lot more is happening, but I think Makerere is an example of how standards go down when some of the policies that were implemented during this time were actually actualized in these universities. And I want to move now to transition and talk about the era of globalization. And this is what I'm calling also the 21st century, and which is talked about in a lot of ways as the knowledge society. What we see here is the purpose of higher education is again shifted. Higher education is being repositioned as a key sector in development, to an extent where we talk about higher education as the engine for socioeconomic development. So this is related obviously to the independence era, where higher education was figured or was configured as very important to developing universities within nation states. And during the era of globalization, this argument is also coming from obviously outside the continent, but saying higher education is key for economic development. But at the same time that we are doing that, there's very reduced state support, because the state has been taken out of being at the center of funding higher education. And once this is happening, we see that every country in Africa, most countries in Africa, they are very challenged in trying to enhance the capacity for higher education, create and increase access, and to apply knowledge to address the development challenges in the countries. This challenge is really tied into where is the funding coming from and what do we envision higher education doing. And it's really very complicated for countries, because the funding is coming in from outside, and it comes in with a lot of strings attached to it. And I also do want to make sure that we make it clear that the idea of the knowledge society that we are talking about during the era of globalization is not a neutral term. It's language that's very tied into ethno and Eurocentric ideas. So and it's a logical extension of previous projects in history that include colonialism, that also tie into neocolonialism. There's the idea that universities should be at the center of developing the skills needed in the market, like we said earlier on. And these ideas, right, are very excluding to other ideas, or they tend to exclude other ideas that are not based on economic development. And we'll see a little bit of this as we go towards the conclusion of this presentation. So having looked at these 4 periods in history in the establishment of universities on the African continent, here are some issues we want to think about as we look at the final pieces of this presentation. The first one is, what are the implications for holding the colonial past as responsible for the weak state of African higher education? The second question I'm asking here is, how does the linguistic diversity, but also the ethnic, the religious, economic and political diversity and complexity of African countries, how do those issues provide opportunities, but also how do they pose challenges for higher education development? And how should we think about the continued use of colonial languages in African higher education? And how about the free access of Western-generated journals and online courses? How should we be thinking about this? And an example is MIT made an offer that they could provide its courses for free. The course outlines, or the course, the course outlines and even the course material, they could make that available freely online for any universities, including universities in Africa, to use as they wish. How should we think about what that means? There's also 6 leading publishers of medical journals in the industrialized countries of the global north who have offered to give free access to their journals to more than 600 institutions in the 60 poorest countries. How does that help improve African higher education, or what are some downsides for adopting or accepting some of these offers that are being put on the table for African countries to develop their institutions? So a couple more slides here to help us think about the language issue or the language complexities and other issues facing African countries. Here is an estimation of some of the languages or number of languages in a select African countries. Cameroon has 24, Chad has 120, Cote d'Ivoire has 60, Ethiopia 86, Liberia 20, Nigeria more than 250, South Africa 11, Zambia more than 70. There are obviously controversies about what counts as a language and so on, but if a country has 60 languages, which language or which languages do we adopt as languages of instruction in universities? Should we focus on one? And how do we decide on which one? Should we focus on more than one language? And how do we fund the development of materials to use in training teachers, language instructors, and publishing and developing the material and publishing the material in multiple languages in a single country, in countries that are already resource limited? How do we do that, right? And this comes back to what I was talking about at the beginning, that I have more questions than answers for some of these issues, but language is one of those. Then apart from language, how do we deal with countries that might not even have a university even now, right? These are examples of some of the smaller countries on the continent, and when they don't have a university or universities are not functional, what does that mean for a country not to have a university? We can also talk about the funding, right? The funding itself. We want you to be thinking, by we I mean people like me who call ourselves critical higher education or African studies scholars. We have been trying to make it clear that the funding for higher education is very crucial for determining what can be accomplished, what cannot be accomplished in these countries. And this slide here is indicative of the imbalances and the inequalities among universities in the global north, particularly here in the US, and universities on the African continent. Harvard, for instance, these are 2011 numbers, has an endowment of $31.7 billion. When you compare that with the total expenditure for all the universities on the African continent around the same time was between 4 and 5 billion. And much of that is going into universities in Egypt and Nigeria and sometimes, and obviously South Africa, Tunisia, and Libya. But the rest of the countries have very small proportions of this 4 billion that's going into their universities. And I want to give an example of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The budget we had in 2015 was $2.4 billion. Right? So a single university here in the US has a budget of $2.4 billion, when the total expenditure of all the universities on the continent, right, more than 50 countries, is just like 4 billion. So what is possible in universities where the funding is so limited? The idea about funding is also tied to what other people have called the second partition of Africa, where much of the money or a significant portion of the money flowing into funding African universities is actually coming from outside the continent. This is quite remarkable because thinking about the University of Dar es Salaam, you go into the university, there is a piece of the university that's funded by Finland. The AIDS research program is funded by Sweden. The community health programs are funded by Germany, right? And all the other countries, Britain, Italy, and Denmark, have all their own corners in the university that they fund. And this is what someone called the second partition of Africa, where it's like pockets of European and other countries coming in to fund specific programs. And those programs might be time limited in terms of how much money goes into those programs. They don't go on indefinitely. Still talking about money, much of the money, right, goes into few. What I'm doing here with this slide is to show you that much of the money coming from outside going into African countries is funding just a select few universities in few countries. So I have listed here a number of programs that have poured in significant amount of funding. An example that I'm giving you here is the Partnership for Higher Education in Africa, which was a collective of donors or foundations that were funding higher education. The countries that they were putting money into are Egypt, Ghana, Madagascar, Mozambique, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania, and Uganda. But so that's quite a lot. But if you think about it together with the African Virtual University, AVU, the Pan-African University, and the other programs funding higher education on the continent, or that have initiatives for higher education on the continent, the 5 top countries being funded are South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, and Ghana. And these are countries that already have the most successful programs when you compare them with other countries on the continent. So these are countries that are relatively successful, and much of the funding is actually going into those countries. So this is not need-based funding. If it was need-based, I would expect to see much of the funding going into Mozambique, going into Malawi, going into the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but much of it is not going into countries that actually need it most desperately. And this story about the aid destination tells us about that. I could have talked about in detail about the Partnership for Higher Education in Africa, but this is a snapshot of where the funding went between 2015 and 2010. You see that the bulk of the money is going into South Africa, which already has a very well-established higher education system. Nigeria, Uganda, and Tanzania, right? The same countries benefiting. As I bring this to a conclusion, I wanted to help us think about what needs to happen. So given this troubled history of African higher education, what are some of the ways we can think about fixing the problems, but also imagining what kind of future the African continent needs? So Ali Mazrui is one of the people who have put very tangible and pragmatic, probably tangible, less so pragmatic, but tangible ideas on what needs to happen, or how we can rethink what needs to happen in African countries. And he talks about decolonizing modernization, and he has 3 ideas that I want us to consider as we conclude this lecture. The first one is what he calls domesticating modernity. And by that he means we need to think in African countries about broadening admission and faculty recruitment criteria. Much of what is happening right now is you need to earn a PhD to get into an academic track where you become a professor or work as a teaching faculty member in universities, or at least in some places a master's degree. So Ali Mazrui is talking about, let's identify people who have And this speaks to what has been called indigenous knowledge, right? So let's identify people we know in our communities who are knowledgeable about life on the continent and in their communities, and let's bring them into the universities to teach and to share this knowledge with students. He also suggests that we need to expand our offerings, the curricular offerings, to include schools of oral tradition, languages and oral literature, religion and witchcraft, and preventive medicine. In other words, let's expand. The curriculum needs to include all the range of other knowledges that for now have not been accepted as valid in universities in Africa. Apart from domesticating modernity, he also suggests that we need to diversify modernity's cultural content. In other words, instead of focusing on Western education systems and Western knowledge systems, we need to bring in Indian knowledge systems in African universities, bring in Chinese knowledge systems, Islamic civilizations, and make them part of what we study in African universities. This might be implemented as requiring that every student going through the university has a European language, which they already have, because English or French or other colonial languages are the languages of instruction. But in addition to that, a person should speak another African language or learn another African language, another Asian language as well. That way we are able to tap into multiple rather than just one knowledge system. Then lastly, he suggests that we should counter-penetrate Western civilization. One way to do that is to build alliances with the Arab world, the Black diaspora, the African Americans, for instance. Try to encourage these populations and these people to actually come to study in Africa, not just like short-term study abroad, but degree granting programs where they come on long-term to study and build those interactions and engagements between those communities as part of counter-penetrating Western civilization. I think this offers an exciting possibility for rethinking African higher education. Whether this is practical in reality is something we can debate, especially because another scholar has argued that it's difficult to conceive higher education differently from what has been offered over time in African countries and across the world. I'll give you an example that's a little radical, but also very illustrative of what I mean by other education systems that we could use or that we could adopt in thinking about moving forward. There's talk that in African countries or communities, there are people who can create lightning and send it to intentionally to go strike someone or strike something. So if I argue with you, someone could threaten me and say, I'm going to send you lightning to come strike you. And every year there are people who are struck by lightning, and people understand in African communities that these are not natural. This is something that someone can actually create intentionally and send a lightning bolt to go strike someone. If this is true, and if this is real, what some critical scholars are saying is, why don't we harness this knowledge? Why don't we make this an object of study in universities so that we understand the art of creating a lightning bolt? Imagine what that would mean for engaging in warfare with other countries or with enemies if we can create lightning bolts and use them. Instead of sending soldiers or sending airplanes, we just strike our enemies with lightning bolts. So like, if we can study this in universities, whether this is possible, right, is what people like Ali Mazrui and others would like people to rethink. But again, what Eke is saying is there is very limited buy-in to do these kind of things. It takes obviously a lot of funding to do it, but what bureaucrats in government and in higher education ministries in African countries are more interested in is to prove that they are equal or better than former colonizers. So they want to do as well as when they offer projects. So their universities, the standards that they are using to measure quality are not standards premised on local knowledges or local needs, but matching themselves to what was there when they took over from colonial masters. And what this does is it creates an education system that validates or invests in the same system that we have been criticizing probably throughout this lecture. Some of the exciting initiatives we see on the continent right now, the Pan-African University is an example. It was proposed in 2008 by the Commission of the African Union. It was endorsed by the Commission in 2009, and it was launched in 2011 and admitted its first students in 2012. By 2014, the first students enrolled through this university, 55, and the first years who graduated in Kenya in 2014. This is exciting because it's not a national university model. It's something conceived as or across the university. There's hubs in the 5 regions of the continent, and it identifies areas that are strategic to the development of the African continent: space sciences, water and energy sciences, basic sciences, technology and innovation, life and earth sciences, governance, humanities and social sciences. And this is a collective effort that brings together the African continent in figuring out their own future. But again, a project like this is really limited or confined to a certain agenda, because the funding, though the African Union Commission is committing to fund this and also to generate money from research and tuition fees and other voluntary contributions, there's a significant amount of external funds that obviously often comes with ties to some conditions. So Germany, for instance, Japan, India, and Sweden are all offering to fund this program. How do projects like these, what do they offer in terms of success stories? What are some of the challenges that you might imagine or experience as we do projects like this? Number one is, how do we harmonize the continent's education systems, which is not harmonized right now? How do you stem the tide of brain drain? How do you not train people and then end up losing them to countries in the global north? And how do you secure the participation and cooperation of African Union member states? How do you mobilize resources to sustain this initiative and make higher education systems competitive and relevant in the knowledge economies of the 21st century? And how do you link with knowledge producers around the world without falling into the trap of these very unequal relationships that determine the funding mechanisms that we see in place? These are some of the few of many challenges and opportunities probably that we see in African higher education. And what I've tried to do with this lecture is to show you the history of how higher education developed and how it was established, and the changes that happened over time in terms of the purposes of higher education, the funding, the role of the state, and the curriculum. And I have ended by showing you the Pan-African University and suggestions for thinking about the future for African higher education. And most of these I present to you as questions that we need to wrestle with rather than as answers, because I think this is way more complicated than we can provide prescribed solutions that are very simple and not applicable in contexts that have this very complicated history. So I want to end here by posing these questions and trying to get you to think about what the future of African higher education is and what is the role that we each can play as individuals, as individual countries, but as a collective global community to support the education which is beyond just schooling, but education broadly conceived on the African continent. Thank you so much.